Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. This is a video panel discussing the upcoming U.S. Japan-Philippines summit, which will take place tomorrow in Washington, amongst the leaders of the three countries. We're interested in digging in today on the question of where that alliance formation might be headed and where the other so-called minilateral alliance formations that the United States has been assembling in recent years might be headed, particularly with regard to how that's going to affect regional issues and U.S.-China geopolitics. This webinar is being put on by the Quincy Institute. My name is Jake Warner. I'm the acting director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute. And I have with me today two distinguished guests. First is Sarang Shidore. He is the director of the Global South program at the Quincy Institute, as well as a senior non-resident fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks and an adjunct professor at George Washington University. His research focuses on geopolitical risk, grand strategy, and climate security, with a special emphasis on the Global South and Asia. He has published widely, including a recent piece, highly relevant to the discussion today, in The Diplomat, titled China-Philippines South China Sea Face-Off Requires Restraint. And second, we have Mike Mochizuki. Mike is the Japan-U.S. Relations Chair in memory of Gaston Seeger at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. He co-directs the Memory and Reconciliation in the Asia-Pacific project at the Seeger Center. And his research focus is Japanese foreign policy, the U.S.-Japan alliance, and historical memory in Asian geopolitics. He's currently working on a book that I am very excited about, called A New Strategic Triangle, the U.S.-Japan Alliance and the Rise of China. And he is also the co-author, along with my colleague James Park, of a Quincy report that will be coming out later this month on the U.S. Japan-South Korea trilateral partnership. So I'd like to kick it off just with a few questions I've been thinking about. This is not my area of expertise, so I'm very excited to hear from these two experts on this question. But one thing that I think has become increasingly relevant to those who are keeping close track on security developments in the Asia-Pacific is the increasing, the deepening, the increasing number, and the interesting ways that these are being interwoven. The small trilateral, bilateral, and including quadrilateral networks, alliances that the United States has been assembling under the Biden administration. So this includes the Quad, Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, the trilateral formation between Japan, South Korea, and the United States, AUKUS, which is Australia, the UK, and the United States. And we just reported recently is that AUKUS is considering beginning to add Japan into that mix. So in some ways, Japan will start participating in AUKUS, or at least there are discussions underway for it to do so. So there are some interesting behind-the-scenes dynamics here, to what extent the different ostensible allies are aligned, or in the case of the Quad, which includes India. India is not a treaty ally of the United States. To what extent a non-treaty ally is willing to go along with the U.S. agenda on these things. And of course, looming in the background is what this means for the U.S.-China relationship and for China's relationship to the region, because it's a fairly obvious open secret that all of these formations are directed at China. And one question we'll be discussing today is what exactly directed in what way? Is this hence the title of our panel today, is this strengthening deterrence or is it exacerbating conflict? So I would like to get right into the set of questions. And I will ask the first one to each of the panelists. We can start with Mike. What has changed in the security posture of Japan over the last 3 years?
Well, first I want to thank you, Jake, and the Quincy Institute for hosting this webinar on this very important topic. You know, I would say the major change in Japan's defense posture was the adoption of the new national security strategy in December 2022. And there were a lot of elements in this new security strategy. But just to highlight some of the major changes, one, as many of you know, Prime Minister Kishida has decided to substantially increase the amount of defense spending in Japan, way beyond the previous kind of ceiling of about 1% of GDP. And under the new calculation of what goes into defense spending, he hopes to raise defense spending to about 2% of GDP, by 2027. The other thing is that Japan has been moving beyond its traditional strictly defensive defense posture. And there are a couple of things in this. One, it has decided to begin procuring long-range strike missiles that could hit the territory of our adversaries, perhaps North Korea and China. And as a first step in this, Japan has decided to procure about 400 Tomahawk missiles. But in the works is an indigenous ballistic missile capability that could strike at the territory of adversaries. And basically, Japan wants this capability to deter by having the ability to retaliate against an attack. The third thing I would emphasize is that building on the 2014 reinterpretation of the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution and the subsequent 2015 security legislation package, Japan has now moved quite swiftly to deepen defense cooperation with the United States, including kind of operational planning as well as joint exercises to deal with possible contingencies that not only relate to North Korea, but to China. And finally, I would emphasize that Japan has been continuing to relax its traditional restrictions on arms exports. And so as a result of these changes, one of the things that's relevant for our discussion today is that Japan will not only be providing capacity building for the Coast Guard capabilities of Southeast Asian states, but has even decided to provide naval frigates to Indonesia. So these are really sea changes in Japan's defense policy.
Thanks, Mike. And as I think notable as those changes are, the changes in the Philippines have perhaps been even sharper. So, Saran, could you address how security posture of the Philippines has changed in the last few years? You're muted, or at least I can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Great. First of all, thank you, Jake. Great to be here on the panel with you and with Mike. Yes, there has absolutely, as you said, been a very major shift in Filipino orientation. And there is a clear moment when that happens, which is the election of the current president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is elected about 2 years back. And initially, actually, the expectations were that he would be a continuity candidate. Indeed, he ran as one. He teamed up with the daughter of the previous president, Rodrigo Duterte, who's Sara Duterte, who's still the vice president. And on his campaign trail, he didn't indicate anything that was to come later in terms of what has come about with respect to the South China Sea and China and the United States. So although Marcos started with visiting China as a state visit to Beijing and was received warmly there, he shifted gears soon after coming to power, responding more forcefully to what had been a series of incidents around the Philippines coast in waters that are contested with China, specifically features such as the Second Thomas Shoal and the Scarborough Shoal. The first thing Marcos did was to up what we can call radical transparency. So whereas the previous president Duterte was seen as much more soft on China and critical of the United States, Marcos brought in the media and publicized incidents that were already increasing in their intensity and sharpness before he came to power. And by doing so, he sort of brought focus on the dispute in a way that wasn't there in the previous 6 years of the Duterte presidency. But then I think the more concrete things that have happened is the amount of closeness that has emerged between the Philippines and the United States in the last 2 years. The visits have become much more frequent. Interactions are very close. There have been a lot of rhetorical statements of partnership. And more concretely, there's been an expansion in U.S. Sites. These are military sites, not called bases, but they were first defined under a previous president before Duterte. There were 5 of those, and 4 more have been added under Marcos. And now, of course, we see joint patrols with the United States in those waters. We see also joint patrols with Australia, and the latest trilateral is a new step in the direction of consolidation of a 3-way partnership, which will certainly have and has security dimensions. So we are seeing a much sharper approach towards China, a much closer orientation towards the U.S. and its core allies in the region. And this appears to be going forward without any serious barriers that I can see, at least in the foreseeable future.
So I think this is really important, right? We're seeing, the Asian security situation has been relatively stable for an extremely long time, and we're seeing changes underway that could alter that may be moving us into a much more dangerous period for the entire region as well as for the United States. So I want to talk about that a little bit. What are the motivations here? Mike, we'll start with you. Can you talk about what the motivations for Japan's strengthening the alliance with the United States, militarizing it, however you want to characterize that? There's one narrative that this is just down to threatening moves by China. This is a purely defensive reaction. So that's, I suppose, one possibility. There's another possibility that this is due to U.S. pressure, or it's a positive inducement of some sort. But I'm also interested in hearing your thoughts on what the domestic drivers might be. How is politics playing into this? What sort of constituencies are there for a tighter military alliance with the United States and a more anti-China posture?
Okay. First, there's no question that a great motivator is what the Japanese see as a deterioration in the regional security environment. And it has several components. One is this general sense that the regional balance of power has shifted dramatically with the rise of China, especially the increase of Chinese military capabilities. So it's not so much that the United States is declining, but relative to China, U.S. military capabilities are not as strong as they were at the beginning of the 21st century. And then also, the Japanese are very concerned that China is using this upgraded military capability to be much more assertive, if not coercive, in using military instruments to intimidate countries in the region in Southeast Asia and Japan. And then they also worry that China, in fact, has changed. Now, there's a debate about this, but in talking with many Japanese in the security policy community, they stress the fact that China is no longer following the strategy of Deng Xiaoping. And under Xi Jinping, China is becoming much more nationalistic. And the pursuit of the China dream really has hegemonic intentions. And then we shouldn't also forget the North Korea factor. North Korea has been, I think, the initial driver in Japan's push to expand its defense capabilities and its defense horizons. And after the failure of diplomacy during the Trump Moon period, I think the Japanese are concerned that there's nothing that will stop North Korea from beefing up its missile capabilities as well as acquiring more nuclear weapons. The other thing that's really important to note is the importance, the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Prime Minister Kishida has repeated this over and over again, that what happened to Ukraine could happen to East Asia. And I think that kind of statement has resonated with the Japanese public, and that has weakened a bit the pacifist sentiment in Japan. Now, in terms of the United States, there's no question that the U.S. security policy community, I would say since the 1990s, has been pushing quite hard to get Japan to be a much more active ally of the United States and to contribute militarily to regional security much more. But on top of that kind of U.S. kind of push, I think the Japanese now are also motivated by what they see as uncertainties in U.S. domestic politics and the implications this has for U.S. Foreign policy. So I think many Japanese are, have what I would call the American abandonment syndrome. And there's a lot of discussion about the implications of the possible election of Donald Trump this year. So during this period, I think Japan wants to seize the opportunity to further tighten the U.S.-Japan alliance so that the alliance will survive, will thrive, even under a Trump administration. I think that's one of the big motivators for Kishida coming to Washington at this time. Now, in terms of domestic drivers, I would rather put it in terms of domestic facilitators. The major constraint on Japanese defense policy and the U.S.-Japan alliance has been Japan's traditional pacifism. But what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years is a substantial rightward shift in Japanese politics. And this really took place during the Abe government. And then the increasing anti-China sentiment in Japan, that has facilitated Japanese security policymakers to push forward this agenda. And one of the paradoxical things is why Prime Minister Kishida, who's had a reputation of being relatively dovish, why he is the person that is now accelerating this more forward-leaning defense policy. And I think there are two aspects to this. One, Kishida is having domestic political problems, and because of that, he doesn't have the political capability to resist the more nationalist-leaning members of the Liberal Democratic Party. And then, ironically, because he has this dovish reputation, I think the Japanese people are more willing to kind of acquiesce to this more assertive defense policy agenda that Kishida is pursuing.
Thank you. Sarang, same question for you. What are the Philippines' motivations here? Thinking about China, thinking about the United States, thinking about domestic politics.
Yeah, so in the case of Philippines, unlike Japan and say Australia, politics, foreign policy and politics in general is very personalized. So one has to, on the domestic side, one has to look at the rise of Marcos and in terms of the way he's looking at the world and the region. But there's no question that the Chinese behavior has also been a factor. At least in the Philippines, it's very much perceived that way. That what has happened really the last 2 years, but even before that, in the last year of the Duterte administration, there's been a sort of a much more aggressive approach from China, which may have been muted in the first years of the Duterte period, but never entirely went away. That's the general perception. And of course, in the case of the Philippines, unlike Japan, we have seen actual features change hands. So we saw the seizure of Mischief Reef in the 90s by China. We also saw a very major incident in the Scarborough Shoal in 2012, which left a bad taste in the mouth of many Filipinos. So there's a history here of Philippines, in a sense, quote unquote, losing features or spaces that it believes they're rightfully its own or lie within its EEZ. And since the legal ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016, there is legal grounds for the Philippines to stand on and to argue that the Chinese presence, militarized or Coast Guard presence and actions in these waters are indeed a violation of that international ruling, which most international lawyers have argued is a very sound and well-constructed ruling. On the other hand, the question still arises as to why are we in such a different place from the previous, period. And here you have to look at the domestic factors and the U.S. relationship. It's not clear why Marcos has taken this on as such a big issue, so sharply different from Duterte. I've been told that he was personally moved by some of the plight of some of the fishermen. That could be a reason. There's also a legacy question. Marcos, his father was an authoritarian leader of the Philippines, and there's a cloud hanging over the family, at least as perceived by some. And he may want to leave a legacy of a leader who made a difference on what is generally a national consensus in terms of Philippines claims and Chinese behavior in the region. But there's a risk to this, given that where things are going, if things go wrong for the Philippines, that could also, of course, hurt his legacy. So he's taking a bit of a risk in stepping out. And finally, the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines is not quite one of equals in terms of power. There's a long history there. There's obviously a strong Filipino presence in the United States. So it's entirely possible that the United States has leaned on the Philippines and at the very minimum seen an open door or half open door and walked right through it and built up what is generally a broader strategy of the United States in the region to bring in allies closer, to create a deeper network between them, and indeed to pull in new actors into the security architecture. So I think all of these factors have sort of weighed in one direction in the last 2 years and have brought us to where we are.
All right, let's think about that. The U.S. motivations here. Before we do that, I want to remind everyone, please submit your questions under the Q&A tab, and we will open up audience questions at the end of our discussion. But yeah, what is the U.S. motivation here? What are U.S. goals? There's this old Chinese talking point that the United States is trying to create an Asian NATO. And China takes that will sound different to American ears, but China takes that as an obvious kind of aggressive move to sort of surround and besiege China militarily, and thinks about the Ukraine war in similar terms, that the expansion of NATO was a key factor in leading to Putin's aggression. So there's an implicit warning that if the United States is going to go in this direction, it could lead to conflict. And it's hard. I think it's hard for anyone who knows anything about geopolitics in the region to imagine an Asian NATO. But interestingly, this sort of like development of minilaterals and trilaterals and the Quad, and the ways that the United States is trying to weave them together, look like maybe it is sort of moving towards something that could sort of stand instead of an Asian NATO. So I want to raise that as a question. Is that kind of where we're heading? Like how do you see American goals, and what do you think the trajectory of the U.S. Japan-Philippines trilateral and all the other minilateral alignments that the Biden administration has been constructing? Start with you, Mike.
Well, that's a very important question, and first, I don't think it can be denied that there are probably some in the U.S. Security policy community who would like to see some Asian version of NATO, kind of a tight collective defense pact. But I think at this point in time, I think the consensus is that that's probably a bridge too far, and it's not at all clear that our Asian allies and partners would sign on to an Asian NATO. And what distinguishes NATO from the kind of security relationships that are developing beyond the bilaterals is Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which basically states that an attack on one member is seen as an attack on all, and it almost guarantees an automatic collective defense response. But if you look at all the different bilateral treaties between the United States and its allies, formal treaty allies in the region, they don't talk about it, the obligations in that way. It's basically that an attack on one of the countries would be seen as a dangerous development, and the allies would then respond according to their constitutional and legal arrangements. So the kind of the defense pact is much looser than than NATO, and so I think American policymakers understand that moving towards some kind of NATO collective defense pact is unrealistic. But what clearly the United States is seeking and has been doing for quite some time is moving beyond the traditional hub and spokes security architecture. And I think American policymakers have begun to refer to this as a lattice-like security structure. In fact, the Quincy policy report called Active Denial that I participated in actually used this term of a lattice-like security architecture. So what you have is a deepening of cooperation in terms of military exercises, sharing of information, sharing of defense industrial and technological capabilities. And so you create kind of the infrastructure for defense cooperation if there is a regional contingency. But it stops short of some kind of a NATO type of hard commitment for the use of force as part of the exercise of collective defense.
Thanks, Mike. Sarang, your thoughts on this? Where the sort of this lattice work system of alliances and partnerships? Where's it heading? What is the U.S. intention?
Yeah, I agree with Mike here that I think the NATO, Asian NATO, as anything that we can foresee is highly unlikely. One reason is I'm not sure the United States even wants that, but more than that, the regional players I'm not sure would be entirely comfortable. They all have different ways of perceiving China, their differences. We are now in 2024. NATO was founded 75 years ago. It's celebrating its 75th anniversary today. It was a different time The time of today is a more dynamic time when even core allies have preferences sometimes that don't align with the United States and will make that clear and pursue, at least to some extent, their national interests in a way that perhaps the U.S. as a major victor in Europe didn't have to deal with back then. So an Asian NATO seems to me almost impossible or certainly highly unlikely. But and the other factor there is also deep interdependence with China. Unlike Europe today, which had less interdependence with Russia even before 2022, all these states, including the Philippines and others, are very much tied to what has emerged as an Asian complex, an economic complex that has been in many ways highly successful in the last 30 or 40 years, has lifted many from poverty. And that's not something states want to entirely threaten. So in Asian NATO, very unlikely. But this lattice network is certainly, as Mike said, more than a hub and spokes arrangement. This is something in between. This is some sort of a flexible, dynamic, posse type arrangement that creates a kind of a structure that the US being in many ways at the node of all these minilaterals, although a few don't have the US in them, but most of them do. And that perhaps gives the United States a kind of a flexibility, a kind of a mix and match ability to vary the temperature of response depending on the theme or the region in question. And allows also a certain level of plausible deniability, because if you have a new NATO or something close to that, then that obviously looks like directly like armed encirclement of China. Here you have much smaller groups of states that are brought together. All of them have concerns about China, and then are brought together in ways that vary in intensity and response and in time. So we have let's say a cleverer 21st century attempt to create some kind of a melding of states that are US allies or are very close, like India, into an architecture. And let there be no question about this. The goal here is to counter China. So although some of the claims of these minilaterals are indeed economic, climate, and other claims, and I'm sure those are certainly being addressed in these minilaterals, the fundamental logic for this is about countering China.
Great. So let's talk about what this looks like from Beijing, and also what it looks like from other regional capitals. So how is Seoul seeing this? How is Taipei seeing this? Jakarta, Hanoi. I mean, everyone is sort of being, because like as the web of minilaterals expands, it's impinging on the future of everyone in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And of course, if China has, as you say, Sarang, if China is the target of this, then China has clear views. What is the sort of regional response of those who are not part of these networks to the expansion of these networks? I'll start with you, Mike.
Well, in terms of how China sees this, and we've already touched on this, but I think there's no question that China sees what is happening as a U.S.-led containment strategy to prevent the rise of China and undermine some of its core interests, especially about Taiwan. And the question is then, how is China going to respond to this? I think the hope of American policymakers and probably Japanese policymakers is by creating this lattice-like structure, China will become more cautious and will be more reluctant to use direct military force to achieve its political goals, especially regarding Taiwan and maybe a sovereignty claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. But at the same time, I believe that China is not going to kind of step back or pull back, retreat, and stop building up its military forces and becoming less assertive. I think this is going to lead China to kind of double down on its current pattern of behavior, which is to increase its military capabilities and increase, what people have called gray zone tactics to pursue its interests. And so, because of this interaction between this lattice-like network that the United States is weaving together and the Chinese view of things and the Chinese response, I think the net effect of this is that there will be increasing militarization of the disputes in the region. It will lead to the possibility of a further geopolitical divide between the United States and Japan and some of its treaty allies, and China and some of its partners like Russia and North Korea. And finally, because of this, I think it raises the risk of an accidental military conflict. I mean, I don't think China, wants to opt for war, but given the militarization of the environment and all of these military drills that are now being increased in the region, the possibility of some kind of incident or some kind of accident that might ignite a military conflict is quite profound. So, although I certainly believe in the importance of some focus on upgrading military deterrence, my major criticism is that there's been such a one-sided focus on military deterrence, and there's not enough of an investment in diplomacy and reassurance towards China so that we can try to de-escalate the tensions that are increasing in the region.
Thanks, Mike. And that helps respond to one of the questions that I think is really important to think about. This came from May Salau, who asked whether deterrence can actually exacerbate conflict. And I think, Mike, what you're saying is that yes, a one-sided military only form of deterrence, because it's not balanced by positive inducements to bring the target along in the direction that you want them to move, that is likely to lead towards destabilizing trends that could eventually end up in conflict. So thank you for that. I want to pose the same question to Sarang and add the second part of May's question, whether there are any possibilities for ASEAN or for international courts to temper, dampen, or even quell some of the aggressive tendencies that we're seeing on all sides here.
Yeah, so in the region of Southeast Asia, the news for the United States is not that great recently. And there was a survey published just a few days back from a leading Singaporean think tank, ICS. They do this every year. This is the State of Southeast Asia survey. And the US has lost a lot of ground in key states in Southeast Asia. This is a poll of elites, but a lot of elites were interviewed, I believe, almost a couple of thousand in total. And you can see a very sharp shift in countries like Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Brunei, even in Thailand, and a couple of others. Now, obviously, the Gaza war explains some of that, especially in Indonesia and Malaysia. It's the US policies that are not being received well. But broadly, the region clearly finds a lack of US policy responses, or in some cases, there's a lot of concern. In the case of the current Philippines, China, US triangular spat, ASEAN states have been very concerned that this is going in a direction that can not only lead to conflict through accident, as Mike said, but also create fractures within ASEAN. ASEAN has been a very successful grouping. It has showed a lot of wins on economics and regional integration. It doesn't typically take strong positions when it comes to hard security matters. But individually, the states of Southeast Asia have not rushed to back the Philippines in this situation. They have stayed away. And even Vietnam, which we might expect to support the Philippines in some form, because it too has a sharp maritime dispute with China, has been very cautious, has issued statements that are even-handed broadly. Of course, we should also remember that the South China Sea disputes, like the ones in the Spratlys, are not just between claimant X and China, but they are multi-cornered typically. So in the Spratlys, we have Vietnam as a major claimant state, and in the past, we have seen Vietnam run up against the Philippines and butt heads with the Philippines to some extent on these features. So it's a complex situation, but broadly, I think the region is not happy in the direction of where things are going. And indeed, Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, the 9-line is not accepted really by any of these states, the claimant states, but also others don't find it a very valid claim. And recent Chinese focus on interfering with Filipino missions to the Second Thomas Shoal are not seen as something that stabilizes the situation. So Southeast Asia is worried and concerned as to where this can go in the future. Although, as is typical in the region, states don't often explicitly message differences. They tend to do that privately. Publicly, they tend to take a much more low-key approach.
Thank you, Sarang. I'd like to turn to the audience questions now. We'll start with one from our friend and colleague, Michael Swain. Can you both speak to what you would like to see happen in U.S. policies towards Japan, Philippines, and the region? Both of you are talking about changes that move the region towards a more forward-leaning zero-sum stance towards China. Is that positive? If not, what would be the alternative? Mike?
Okay, well, I'll take a crack at that. First of all, I am opposed to the kind of recent moves by the United States and Japan and the Philippines and Australia to begin to conduct joint drills in the South China Sea. And we've already seen the response by China. I mean, China is now engaging in military drills in the South China Sea. And so this is part of the zero-sum dynamic and the reaction that is militarizing the South China Sea and enhancing the danger of an accident. And so, I would personally recommend exercising restraint and not doing this sort of thing. But I'm not sure that my views will be reflected in government policy. If we are going to move in this direction, I think at a minimum, what we need to do is to have a serious dialogue with the Chinese to first establish kind of workable confidence-building measures, including the prior notification of exercises and making sure that these exercises do not take place in places which are highly sensitive and risk the kind of military accident that could lead to a kinetic conflict. And then, I know that this is something that Michael Swain has been pursuing for decades, is that there has to be serious discussions not only between the United States and China, but between China, the United States, and U.S. allies and partners about effective crisis management mechanisms and processes and understandings, because we've had tense situations develop before, and given the track record of those incidents, is quite worrisome. And so we should definitely be promoting crisis management mechanisms. And then I think what's really important, and this is where I'm very critical of Japan. Japan is basically following the American lead on this. And although the Biden administration has taken some steps to try to kind of put a floor in the deterioration of Sino-American relations, the Japanese have been really quite passive in all of this and has invested very little in a diplomatic effort to engage China at the highest levels of the Chinese government. So this is really a shortfall in Japanese foreign policy, and I think it goes against their enlightened self-interest.
Thanks, Mike. Can I keep with you for a second just to address another question along those lines? Julian Sherrod asked if there's anything that Japan can do to play a stronger role promoting regional security by acting as an alternate power to both U.S. and Chinese influence, either through diplomacy, through a greater economic influence in Southeast Asia, through investment. Like what do you think the options are for Japan that would point in a different direction than the deepening militarization we're currently going?
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, some people argue for a greater Japanese military role, but given the aging society, the stagnation of the Japanese economy, the huge budget deficit, the idea that Japan could develop enough military capability to be kind of a third player that could dramatically change the balance of power is just nonsensical. And so the alternative approach that I think Japan can take is to build coalitions, to build networks with other middle powers in the region. I talk about a middle power network, and all of the countries on the periphery of China, first of all, do not want to choose between the United States and China, and do not want to have a military conflict in the region, because much more than the United States, they are going to suffer directly if there is a military conflict between the United States and China. And so by developing this middle power coalition, spanning from Northeast Asia with South Korea to the ASEAN states, to Australia and New Zealand and India, that could be a kind of a third force in this bilateral zero-sum competition that is escalating between the United States and China. And so it's really to have Japan show more agency in the current environment rather than just following the lead of the United States.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm back to that initial question about the United States. Do you think that there are a different direction the United States should be taking, or how would you counsel U.S. policy in regional alliances?
I think the U.S. Goal if the U.S. goal is not having an Asia where China has primacy, that's reasonable. If the U.S. goal is to return to or maintain U.S. primacy in the region, that would be a very dangerous goal indeed. So we have to first clarify what is the American goal in Asia broadly. And if the goal is a former, then I think, as it should be, then I think the United States is overstepping. If you look at the broader region, not just the Philippines, there are many examples where the U.S. has taken on a very forward-leaning posture, has been front and center, whether it's joint patrols, whether it's EDCA sites, these new U.S. quote-unquote bases, I should say quote-unquote agreed locations, which are military sites in the Philippines. The new ones are all positioned uncomfortably closer to Taiwan. And there are strings of islands even closer to Taiwan that are being, infrastructure is being built with U.S. assistance. So things of that sort, when the United States is at the front edge of countering China in this militarized manner, raises anxieties and confirms the worst fears of Chinese nationalists on the other side, who will and are responding in kind. So the U.S. being so front and center at the leading edge of many of these activities, I think is unhelpful. At the same time, the United States should be confident of its current presence in the region. After all, if you look at the Pacific, it's still very much a US lake. There are territories and maritime zones that are completely dominated by the United States. The US has Guam. The US has also concluded a pact with Papua New Guinea, is looking to militarize Micronesia more. These are moves that may or may not be advisable, but certainly are mean that the US has a sort of a presence in the wider maritime space that China can only dream of having, not to mention stalwart allies like Japan and Australia, and a much more friendly India over the last 2 decades. So I think there are these sharp edges of these hotspots like the Second Thomas Shoal or the South China Sea near the Philippines, where the US can take a much more discreet role, allow regional players to define policies, assist them in strengthening their capabilities, but also lean on them to restrain some of the more adventurous moves that are occurring in the region. So I think there is this anxiety in Washington that has gone too far. And of course, then the other side of the equation is, if the claims are that some of these minilaterals at least are primarily about public goods, let's see those public goods being delivered. Right now, the Quad hasn't delivered a whole lot. It's been around in its second wind for the last 8 years. We haven't seen a whole lot being delivered, apart from some elements that have quasi-military dimensions in them. So if the United States leads with its partners and allies in the region and actually starts solving problems in the region in a way that China cannot, or in ways that complement Chinese activities in the region, I think that would be welcomed by the region. It would actually add to American influence without provoking conflict or risking a sort of clash that can pull the US into something nobody wants. And finally, I think the US should also dial back on some of the rhetoric that we are seeing. We just saw a few days back US ambassador to China say that the Scarborough Shoal and the Second Thomas Shoal are sovereign Philippines territory, which is incorrect, even by the PCA ruling of 2016. So getting ahead of what is international law is not a wise way forward.
Thanks, Sarang. I want to stay with you because I think you're getting into some territory that a couple of people had questions about. The first question comes from James Chabin, is on that question of development. Of course, advancing development is always a feature of the rhetoric around each of these agreements, but it sounds like you're skeptical. You don't see much follow through on that these really are motivated by security, and as such, development is being kind of left aside. So that question, and a second question here about the Quad specifically and India's role in all of this. Of course, as I mentioned, India is not a U.S. treaty ally. There are very strong differences between the U.S. and India on Russia, for example. There has been some criticism in Congress, anyway, about India's human rights record. How does India fit into all these questions? And are we likely to see the sort of military relationship between the U.S. and India progress at all?
Right. So on the first question of development, I mean, there's no question the US is still very much present in the region. It's the biggest investor. It's still a very major trading partner in the region. So we're not talking of a situation where the US is disappearing by any means. The problem is that all of this is historically true. So in a space where China has emerged as a very dynamic new actor just in the last 10 years with BRI, where you're seeing Japan upping its game, where you're seeing even India increasing its presence and footprints economically. What is the United States doing that is of a leadership level? And not a whole lot. There have been some initiatives certainly announced on climate with the Pacific Islands. Gina Raimondo was in the Philippines recently and promised $1 billion of new investment. There's, of course, a friendshoring push that's ongoing. But broadly, the United States seems to be coming to the region more appealing to countries that China's intentions are not good, and then waving things to them that don't seem to quite match up to what China has on the table and on offer. So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is in many ways underwhelming. The US has walked away from the idea that trade, if properly done, can be a engine of success, of prosperity and growth on both sides. IPEF does not have market access. Domestic sentiment, obviously, in the US is very hostile to any such trade agreements. In general, there are a couple of exceptions, but broadly, that is where the sentiment is at. So I think there has to be a conversation, and I think I want to bring this back to the US domestic scene, because I think there needs to be some leadership in US domestic politics to start talking about these things, such as trade, such as investment. Where is the United States? Where can it add value? What's it good at? How can it bring partners in? Sometimes even bring China into questions like climate change, and try to emerge as a problem-solving leader, not just add military deterrence with one announcement after another and expect all things to fall into place. That's not going to happen. Your second question on India's role, I think there's a long bipartisan trend on both sides in India and the US of a convergence that began in the late 90s, around 2000, and it's continued irrespective of administrations. And very bluntly put, the core glue that binds that convergence is China. The rise of China creates a lot of anxiety in India. There was a war in 1962. There was a recent incident in 2020 where soldiers died. There are territorial contestations along a very long border. And there is, of course, a rivalry between India and China in terms of civilizational claims. Both see themselves as mega civilizations of Asia and the world, and there's a natural rivalry there. So the United States has seen that opening way back in the late days of the Clinton administration and seized it and built what is a much stronger partnership with India that has taken on security dimensions. That's a trend that I think is broadly still in the works, still very much present. Structural logic drives that trend. And I don't see a very sharp pullback from that in the immediate future.
Thanks, Sarang. We're about out of time. This has been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank both panelists for your insights. I want to close with a question that I think helps us bring this down from the level of looking at pieces on a chessboard, and even when we talk about the possibility of creating the conditions that could lead to war, it still just seems kind of abstract. Like we don't really often seem to be talking about real human beings with lives when we have these discussions. This question is from Kazuyuki Nakazoto, who asks about the reactions of citizens in Japan and the Philippines, especially those citizens who are likely to be directly affected by the militarization of the relationship. And obviously this can be seen most clearly in Okinawa in Japan, where US bases for the better part of a century have been consistently protested by locals. And that has proven a headache in the alliance that the Japanese government and the US government have consistently sort of shoved aside. But those dynamics are important to consider, and it helps us to see that these sort of alliance moves have effects in real people's lives. So, Mike, could you talk just for a minute about the possible effects around expanding militarization for people who would be directly affected in Japan? And Sarang, maybe if you have any thoughts on what might happen in the Philippines. Of course, the U.S. has a very long history of bases in the Philippines that also occasioned much local protest, and that was largely ended after the end of the Cold War. But is that in danger of coming back? Start with Mike.
Well, one of the interesting things is that the U.S. military has now recognized that the heavy concentration of U.S. military bases in Okinawa makes them highly vulnerable to Chinese missile attacks during a high-intensity conflict over Taiwan. And so the U.S. Air Force is kind of responding to this change in the environment by talking about the rapid dispersal of U.S. Air Force from Okinawa. By contrast, the U.S. Marine Corps is now doubling down and restructuring its units so that they can actually engage Chinese forces in what they call the contested environment, which definitely means the Taiwan Strait. Also, the Japanese Self-Defense Force is now deploying missile units on the Southwest Island chain in Okinawa. And all of this is creating intense fears among the residents of Okinawa. I mean, one of the slogans of protesters of these recent moves is Gaza today, Okinawa tomorrow. And the Japanese government is sensitive to this, so they are developing evacuation plans if there are attacks on the Southwest Islands of Okinawa Prefecture. But what is misguided about this approach is that if there is a high-intensity conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan, it's quite possible that China will not only go after U.S. military bases in Okinawa, but after U.S. military bases on the main islands of Japan. And so the entire Japanese archipelago is likely to be engulfed in an escalating military conflict between the United States and China. And so the only way to kind of address this issue is not to double down on increasing militarization, but to move towards tension reduction with kind of direct diplomacy with China and Taiwan. And because the U.S. and Japanese governments aren't really doing that, the governor of Okinawa, Denny Tamaki, is now engaged in his version of regional diplomacy by reaching out to regional governments as well as civil society organizations in the region to try to de-escalate tensions and to provide a stable framework for peace in the region.
Thanks, Sarang. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think if we are talking about the Philippines specifically, there is, of course, a history in the Philippines of huge U.S. bases during the Cold War, Clark and Subic Bay, and then a strong sort of a blowback when the fall of Marcos, and you had a people power movement, and then the United States had to leave the Philippines, vacate those bases. And so for a long time there, between 1992 and around 2014 or so, the United States was not really present in a military sense in the Philippines in any significant way. That has changed now with the Visiting Forces Agreement signed and then the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement added to that. And we have seen the return of U.S. Footprints, military footprints that are not called bases, but they very much look like bases. And they're not supposed to be permanent bases. So you have a rotational deployment of U.S. troops. But the idea is that U.S. troops will always be present in many of them. So they certainly look like bases to other players there, especially China. And there hasn't been necessarily that kind of a response as we saw in the 90s. However, there is domestic dissidence to this expanding U.S. footprint. When the EDCA expansion was announced, the governor of the northern province of Cagayan expressed his opposition, his concerns very publicly. Of course, as a regional governor, he did not have a foreign policy role as such. And so the president's decisions were final. But there's also been dissidence from very senior senators, including the president's own sister, who has raised concerns and has asked questions about whether this can pull the Philippines into a conflict over Taiwan, for example, that really no Filipinos want that. In the Philippines, there isn't this sort of any great passion for defending Taiwan as such. or defending democracy in Taiwan. The sort of rhetoric you see in Washington isn't present. However, there are 160,000 Filipinos working in Taiwan, and these overseas foreign workers are a concern of the citizenry and any government. So there is that element. But broadly, Filipinos are going along at the moment. The situation is such that there is a strong fervor of nationalism and skepticism of China. But in the Philippines, just looking at its politics, there are swings, and one cannot count out if the United States overplays its hand, or if this thing goes out of hand broadly from all sides, then we will see a politics in the Philippines that again wants some change to the current trajectory.
Thank you. Thank you both. This has been a very rich discussion. I've learned a lot. I hope all those of you who joined us in the audience have learned a lot. I'm really struck by how significant and important the changes underway in the Asian security architecture are, and also by how little they are being discussed within U.S. democracy. So I thank you both for your contributions to trying to bring these into the public realm, and I hope that we will raise the profile of these issues and have a serious discussion in our country. Thanks everyone for joining us. On behalf of the Quincy Institute, have a good day.